Hello everyone. In this short episode, we will look at some aspects of labor in developing countries, some of the broad picture questions, and also a perennial policy question about workfare in relationship to welfare. And this is based on section 5.7 in chapter 5 of economic development. And so most people derive most of their income, most of the time, in most places, from the work they do, that is to say, their labor. For most people, income from other sources such as rent and profit and so on is comparatively small. And so approximately 3.3 billion people in the world currently work, about half the people in the world. Having a work in developing countries by no means having wages. So first of all, as we've already seen, in most developing countries, a minority of income comes from what we conventionally think of as a job, in which you go to work, paid for by an employer at regular hours, with some legal regulations indicating how much you have to work and how much you can get paid within some reasonable limits. Instead, at least close to half are engaged in some self-employment. That can be on a subsistence farm or maybe even a family-sized farm, we hope, and can be micro-enterprises and so on. But it's often precarious. There's often weak property rights. You may not be able to have confidence you can hold on to your assets, for example. You don't know what income will be. We often talk about living on $2 a day or something like that. But for most people, that doesn't mean a wage coming in of $2 a day. It means one day you may have $4 and the next day you may have zero. And so the wage labor, on the other hand, that is found is often in low productivity work. Wage labor does not mean that you're in the modern sector necessarily. So there's irregular incomes, occasional incomes from wage labor also, including on farms, but in other activities. And it's all too often subject to abuse. So there's a great importance in having high quality jobs. So as I mentioned, work is the way that most people get most of their income. It's also the place where people spend very much of their time. If you think about even a 40-hour week, that's a large fraction of a person's time in their life. And so the type of work that you're doing has significant constraints on possibilities of getting future high income because of the fact that many skills that are learned are actually learned on the job. However, whether there are skills to be learned, new skills that can give you broader opportunities for the future, depends fundamentally on the type of work that you're doing. And so broadly speaking, we can think of jobs as a place where people can gain capabilities that they may not already have, and they can maintain their capabilities. Once we have capabilities, they're not guaranteed, they don't last, they do depreciate like other capital, you can lose them. Skills and attitudes that people develop at jobs affect at least how others perceive as well their capabilities in other spheres. For example, and in particular, people who have jobs that develop multiple capabilities are often more engaged in civic affairs or have better social networks. And so high inequality in labor markets can also serve to magnify other forms of inequalities. And this is important to keep in mind. So then what can policy do? Well, an important thing policy can do is just to reduce constraints, some of which could be caused by perhaps well-intended but not well-designed government policies. Reduce constraints on job creation. But one thing is to build the necessary infrastructure. Infrastructure is often a complement with private investment. The two go together in order to produce profit opportunities. Also ensure incentives don't hinder quality job creation. You may have some policies that are well-intended, or that are undertaken because they're an effective way just to raise taxes, but you have to be careful. So reforming some laws, though, and even more so reforming norms is difficult. So quite often there are not just norms, but various laws that either intentionally or just implicitly tend to discourage women from working. But as we saw, work is where you get much of your income and also have the best opportunities to build on your capabilities. And programs for employment when jobs are scarce can help, but they need careful design and implementation as well. So here we are thinking about public sector work, such as guarantees of jobs when they're not otherwise available. Partly in this connection, a perennial topic that's talked about in development economics is the question of welfare versus workfare. If people are living below the poverty line, do you just transfer cash, which is favorable in many ways, or when cash is short, or there's great concern on the part of some about incentive effects, is workfare better? That is to say, you provide income, but one works in exchange for this. So let's suppose for a moment that welfare funds are limited. Then the economic theory concludes that workfare is more likely to represent a less costly policy, a policy that ends up spending less money, than welfare direct fund transfers, cash transfers, on a current program efficiency basis. So this is a narrow view when some criteria are met. Now the workfare programs include some of those discussed in the text. One was the famous pioneering Bangladesh Food for Work program, which then became Food for Education program. So here are the criteria. The first is that it's harder to screen the poor without a workfare requirement. So if your idea is that you want to transfer funds to the poor, but you're not sure how many people are poor, and you're certainly not sure which of the people are poor, and it's difficult to find out, people look poor to the policymaker, let's say. Harder to find out who the poor are without a workfare requirement, because people who are well off are unlikely to accept these jobs, which don't pay very much and involve hard work. So that this is a way of finding out who is poor. Poor workers also have lower opportunity costs of time under conditions when it's more efficient to have workfare. So the economy loses little output when they don't work, so that the further below the poverty line people are, the more cost effective it is. Non-poor workers, as another condition, have higher opportunity costs of time. So they're unlikely to participate just to get the benefits. Then, if the fraction of population living in poverty is smaller, in this case, the extra costs of a universal fund transfer scheme would be high if that is the case. For example, if 90% of the people are poor and you give funds to everyone, then only 10% of the people are getting funds that they don't really qualify for. So all of these are factors in an efficiency trade-off. So also keep in mind that all of these factors have to be accounted for together in the theory. It's all part of one general analysis to determine whether welfare or workforce is more comparatively cost effective on these criteria. This is a set of criteria that come out together in the model as a whole. Also keep in mind that the only factor being discussed so far here is whether or not it costs more in expenditure to have welfare rather than workfare. And so human capital factors we'll turn to next. So another important factor in the choice is to see that the program doesn't reduce incentives for the poor to acquire human capital. This is often a suggestion that that's time consuming, maybe costly, There's less incentive to do so if you can just go and get a job in the workfare program. And also, this is a social efficiency design consideration that can save some expenditures viewed across time, including what's viewed as the incentive of children to stay in school. So, this is largely addressed to incentivize school-age children not to see future workfare participation as an alternative to putting high effort into school, into their school year now, into continuing their education, so that one program design response here, which is a common response that goes all the way back to the English Poor Laws, might be very high work hour requirements for participation as a deterrent for people to look ahead and think of this as an option. On the other hand, it can't be so high that those who later do need the program, because they're poor, don't participate. So this is part of the discussion also. An additional consideration is the incentive for adults to build skills. This is not usually talked about, but it would require a different approach to program design. One approach would be to include skill building along with the work. This may be obvious, but seems to have been difficult to put into place, or hasn't been usually. And so a requirement might be participation in work activities that also build relevant skills, or devote part of the time to training. And so finally, just to note, another strategy is to add requirements for school attendance if this workfare program is used over time, and so that if necessary, one can even consider providing training as well as schooling for those who dropped out of school at the work site. In conclusion, or the final points, is that there are some other significant factors in the choice that need to be considered as well. So one of them is that if there are greater net benefits of the program's work output, it's considered a better program, or maybe. So in the regular economic analysis, the actual work that's performed in this program is treated as a kind of a wash. That is to say, you have to pay managers in order to design the work that's being done, to supervise the work, to observe the work, try to maintain its quality, and so on, and that costs something. Of course, the people working in the program are presumably doing something of value, not digging ditches and then filling them back in. So even though it's of value, the people participating are usually thought of as being low skilled, and so that when you think about the cost of managing the program in relationship to the low productivity of the work, that's just kind of treated as a wash. If on the other hand there's greater net benefits of the program's work output, that kind of changes the picture a little bit. And so I would like to point out here that quite often the work that one sees people doing in these workfare programs in South Asia and elsewhere is work close to where the poor people live and on infrastructure that therefore may benefit them. Examples are stone paved roads that go to a village area that may have been otherwise cut off, or at least cut off during the rainy season, and so forth. Another example could be an irrigation or drainage ditch, depending upon what's needed. Channels, that is to say, ditch is the wrong word, but channels for irrigation or channels for drainage that can have the effect of improving farm opportunities and farm productivity more generally. And so these are activities that you can see people doing who are working in food for work or wages for work. And sometimes there's an opportunity also for migration, so that in India, some of the food for work or income for work opportunities that's part of the MNREGA, it's a general program that guarantees work for 100 million families. Some of the possibilities are that workers from the poorest area go to less poor areas and are able to make significant income compared to what they could make at home, such as moving in India from Bihar to Haryana. So that even if the efficiency of the workers working in these programs is a lot lower than it might be if one had hired a private firm, if the government had contracted this out, or perhaps used its own maintenance crews to do this work. Nonetheless, the poor have less political clout, so that it may be that without these programs, those roads to the poor areas never get built, irrigation never gets extended, drainage doesn't get extended, maybe irrigation systems are built, but they're always filling in with mud and silt, and so this program is restoring those. Otherwise, that might not happen. So there's some possible value just in that should not be overlooked. Another factor is whether there's less social stigma of being part of a visible workfare program. Is it embarrassing to be seen working in this activity? And so clearly one thing you don't want to do from a capabilities or simply humane point of view is to have a situation in that the poor are suffering humiliation or being deterred from the needed work because they're seen participating in this program. Different cultures have very different norms. For example, in Bangladesh and parts of India where I have visited and done research, the poor seem absolutely comfortable talking about their poverty. There's no shame in it, it's simply a fact. But that's not going to necessarily be true everywhere. And if it's a major factor, makes part of the case for a more discrete welfare transfer. And that's worth thinking about also. Clearly, you also have to have alternatives available for disabled people. Or others who are just fundamentally prevented for one reason or another from taking part in the program. It can't be the only aspect of a poverty program by any means. And at the end of the chapter 5, there's a section on the need of a package of policies for poverty reduction, partly for these kinds of reasons. And so then the question is, which can better encourage farmers and micro-entrepreneurs to take favorable business bets, which is like a functioning safety net, other factors considered. So it works the other way as well. Rather than being a discouragement for example, starting and expanding your business, you can take more risks, more favorable bet entrepreneurial risks, but that still have some risks that things go wrong if you have something to fall back on if it doesn't work out. And if there's really not otherwise a possible basic income for everyone, this is a fallback. If your microenterprise collapses, you know that you can at least go and work in this program and as a result have income for your family. And so that's the kind of trade-offs that are discussed here, and on that I'll end this episode.